Margaret here from Mud Run Guide. I am with Adam Kimble. It's not week. Episode 7 just aired
Yep.
of The Wheel. And so thanks for being here again this week to chat about The Wheel.
Great to be back. We got one episode to go after this one, so getting down to the wire.
I know this is exciting. I mean, it's exciting. I guess the first thing we should talk about is Lindsay. It's now down to two. It's the two of you guys. It's Luke
Yes.
and you
Yeah.
going into the finale. And Lindsay tapped out in this past episode. And it kind of reminded me of what we've already seen with past people. As we talked about before, it's almost like this show has become a vision quest or like some like ritual or spiritual journey for all of you guys on the show. So,
Yeah.
so do you want to talk about what was it like watching Lindsay kind of come to the end of her journey when you watched that?
I mean, obviously, this is an experience where you're rooting for everybody. You want to see everybody do well because it's not me versus them. It's all of us ideally, achieving great results together. So it was sad to see Lindsay go, but at the same time, very cool and emotional in a positive way to see her go because, like you said, she had this super vivid dream where she saw her pawpaw, who was like, losing him was a big motivator for her to continue on in the journey and to sort of use her experience to honor his legacy. And she got to the point where she could feel, and I can relate to this because I've had similar experiences where she felt through this dream like she was actually speaking to him, and he was saying, hey, if you're ready to stop, you've done a great job. I'm proud of you. That's it. And she woke up with total clarity and was like, and it's just amazing. She goes 35 days, and on that 35th day, she knows with complete certainty that it's her time to go, and she made that call.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really powerful kind of moment when she was just kind of like, I had this dream, it's done, I'm done, okay, this has been great, time to go back to life. And what I thought was really powerful was when she talked about how this journey has taught her to, appreciate people that have less than her. And she was talking about, I mean, I don't know if you've had conversations with her. She said when she was leaving that she wanted to reach out and help sort of like the underprivileged or homeless communities because she really felt like she felt empathy, and she's like, now I know what it's like to not have a home, not have food.
Yeah. Right. I think I told you maybe last week or the week before that I related to Lindsay quite a bit because of our backgrounds and interest in endurance events. And it's funny because I think in a lot of ways we think somewhat similarly because she has said things on the show that I either said or thought to myself while I was there as well. And one of those things was about hunger and people going through hunger and the homeless and kind of having a different perspective on what that's like moving forward. I mean, it's the classic cliche of you don't know what somebody's going through until you walk a mile in their shoes, right? Well, we were afforded the opportunity to, in a slightly different manner, walk in those shoes, so to speak, and came out with a totally different perspective. And I'm the same way too. I sort of made a vow to myself that I would not forget the feelings that I was feeling when I was out there. And one of those things was hunger and what that felt like and what that feels like for people who have to go through it on a daily basis. And so I'm with her. I want to do everything I can to help those communities and be active in volunteering and helping out wherever I can.
Yeah, and I guess speaking of food, I think we're now seeing the lighter side of Adam again this week. It's interesting because before we started recording this as well, I've been doing some other reading where they've talked about the whole brain, gut, heart connection, and that our gut helps control our emotions and our serotonin and all these different things in our body we don't think about. And you talked about how when you had food, you're on this high. When you didn't have food, you're on this low. And this week, I think you were on like a super high when you had your fish nuggets. So do you want to talk a little bit about fish nuggets?
Yeah. So it's funny. I left the Amazon and I had been doing pretty good getting fish there, especially in the last week that I was there. So I came in, and then last week when I had that emotional scene where I talked about, it felt like to that point, I hadn't had a moment where I was as close to quitting as I was on that day in the previous episode. And I mentioned that I thought it was directly tied to the amount of food that I was eating because It was amazing. I got to that zone. I felt like I was all excited. I'd been eating well in the Amazon, and then I didn't eat for 2 or 3 days. And it's like, boom, all of a sudden my mental state takes a dive,
Yeah.
and then vice versa when I started casting the net out. And so let me backtrack just a second. So I want to be clear here that I was using the cast net in every zone that I was in, the tundra, the island, the Amazon, and I had no success with it in any of those zones. So it was kind of like when I got to the wetlands, I thought to myself, well, I haven't had any success with this. Let's fish with a line first. So for the first couple of days, I just used a fishing line, and the fish were nibbling at it, but I couldn't hook them, right?
Yeah.
And then the time that they show me casting the net, that was my first cast of the net, and I pulled in like 22 fish. And then from that point on, every single day at every meal, so 3 times a day, I was usually eating. A lot of them were smaller fish, with a few exceptions. There were some big ones, but I was eating anywhere from 25 to 70 plus fish per meal. And that was tremendous. It was only like a 3-day span where that happened, but once I started doing it, it was amazing. So the fish nuggets that you're talking about, that was a staple of my diet for the final 3 or 4 days that I was in the wetlands, and it significantly improved. You could tell I talked about I felt like I was reborn when I was in the wetlands, and it was a renaissance, and it totally felt that way.
Yeah, so let's talk about the wetlands. You have done pretty well with your shelters, pretty well for the most part everywhere else. The wetlands, it seems like you could not find a great shelter at first.
Yeah, it was, there were some areas that looked like they were good, and I would sort of test them out a little bit for a few hours during the day to see how things were looking, and then it would totally change. The wetlands were when I was there, surprisingly unpredictable when it came to the weather. Sometimes there was huge winds that would blow through for hours at a time. And then there was several storms that happened while I was there, and it would rain, for significant periods of time. And then when the rain stopped, then it was back to 90 plus degrees and 100% humidity. So that was to that point, I think that was the most unpredictable zone weather-wise that I was in. The other places, the Amazon was hot all the time. It rained as well, but it was mostly just hot all the time. And then the tundra and the island were both cold, especially the island. But it didn't waver too much. The wetlands was up and down the whole time I was there.
Yeah, and it seems like, and Luke had structure problems too when he got to the tundra. So it seems like you guys were both having parallels when you were there, that the weather really kind of, it's just pretty much the weather, it seems like, played the factor in for both of you guys.
I can't tell you how stressful it is to see a storm rolling in on any day that I was out there on the wheel. It's just like one of those things where all you do is think to yourself, I hope this isn't pouring rain for a long period of time. I hope it doesn't, blow away my shelter or prevent me from making a fire and cooking food. It's just an extra thing that you didn't want to have to deal with whenever you saw something coming in.
Yeah. So I guess, we're going into next week's the season finale.
Yep.
It's now you and Luke, and you're headed next to the mountains. We saw in the preview. Luke's headed next to the island, which I'm really interested to see because everyone seems to have had trouble in the mountains. So it'll be interesting to see how you do in the mountains.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see if Luke finds all the food that you seemingly found, because it seems like at this point it's just about food and finding food, because the shelter, it seems like you guys have all sort of figured out how to make shelters wherever you end up. Right. I think Luke's the king of shelters right now.
Yeah, there's no denying that.
But it seems like now it's just finding the food, and as we talked about when you did the island, the food is in an unlikely place, or at least you found those like barnacle looking things, you flipped them over, and then there were crustaceans. Yeah,
exactly. It'll be interesting to see if Luke is able to locate the food right away. I think he's talked about on the show, or maybe he hasn't talked about it, but they haven't made any reference to him and his rations. So I'm thinking at this point he's probably pretty good with his rations. It seems like he's had enough food otherwise on that. And so it'll be interesting to see if he finds the food and if he needs it based off of how much he has stored up already.
Yeah, so I guess at this point, how much food did you have at this point too, as we go into the last episode?
Yeah, so heading into the Bush Plains and then to the mountains, I think I had about half of my rations left, I would say. I was fortunate that with the trail mix, I basically replenished that with the Brazil nuts that I had in
Yeah.
the Amazon, so that was huge. And then when I was in the Bush Plains, they showed me rip my net,
Yeah.
and
Oh
that
yeah,
was
we should talk about you ripping your net. I
yeah,
had forgotten about that until now. So
yeah.
talk to us about this rip net because I mean, it was actually as my fiance was watching, he said, "Don't pull it, just get in the water and like fish it out." So,
Yeah, yeah. It's so funny because when I was watching it, I said the same thing. I mean, all I can think to myself is it had to have been just a hunger decision, you know? Like sometimes I'm thinking to myself, why would I have done that or why would I have approached it that way? You know, I'm just yanking instead of getting into the water. It made so much more sense, but I don't know. I think maybe I just wasn't thinking. But and they didn't show this, but I had some good success in the Bush Plains casting the net. On the show, it almost seemed as though that was one of the first casts that I made, and then I ripped the net. I had a solid maybe 3 or 4 days there of catching quite a few fish with the net, and then it ripped, and that was quite unfortunate because that was, as I said in the episode, that was my number one source of securing food was that net.
yeah, so I guess at this point, well, I mean, we'll have to see how you do heading to the mountains with no net and for what it sounds like it's going to be one of the longest spins on the wheel, too, is that last place that you guys end up.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that this will be the only zone where Luke and I know the length of the zone because we know that this was
Oh,
set out to be
yeah.
60 days. So I was keeping track of every single day with the journal that I had, and so I knew when I left the Bush Plains, I knew there was 16, I think, days remaining in the mountains. So that adds a different element to it as well.
Yeah, then it kind of becomes like the last couple miles in a race where you know that you're there. It doesn't matter
Exactly.
if you're crawling there. You know that the finish line is in sight.
Exactly. Yeah, it changes your mental attitude and strategy, but at the same time, I don't know if they're going to talk about this, but one of the things that I was talking about, sort of getting to this point was when I was early on in my running career, when I wasn't running ultras yet, I was running half marathons and marathons. I ran this half marathon in Chicago. It was a super hot day. Had this really weird experience where I got to the very, very end of the race, and there was sort of an overhang before you crossed underneath the finish line. So maybe 50 yards away from the finish line. I crossed under this overhang, and it was a super hot day. I'm pretty sure I was dehydrated, and in my head, I thought that I'd crossed the finish line, even though the timing clock and the finish line is right ahead of me. And so I crossed over this line. I went over to the side and I laid down. And one of the race officials came over to me and asked if I was okay, and then told me that I hadn't finished the race. And then I popped back up and sprinted across the finish line. So the point being, crazy things can happen even when the finish line is seemingly right in front of you.
Well, perfect. I think that's a perfect place to end it at and kind of leaves it as a cliffhanger. So we'll have to see if you tap out, feet from the finish line or if you make it all the way to the end I guess on Friday. So
Yep.
Friday night, Discovery Channel, check your local listing based on the time, watch the
Yep.
wheel, see the season finale and see if Adam makes it for the full, and Luke too, of course, see if
Yep.
you guys make it all the way to the finish line.
And last thing, Lindsay is doing a Facebook Live on the Wheels page actually right now. So that will be on their page whenever people want to go view that as well.
Cool, and we'll link that in the article as well so people can watch that.
Awesome.
Great.
All right.
All
Talk
right,
to you after the finale.
Yeah.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.